I was 5 years old, my parents took me canoeing on the Ohio River. Now, when I think of the kind of families that go canoeing for fun, I imagine them as young, youthful, vibrant. Uh, they definitely have a dog, possibly wearing a bandana, who, jumps out of the back of their Subaru and bounds down the trail to the river, followed by the happy family, eager to embark on another one of their many outdoor adventures. But the thing was, we were not that family. To say that my mom and dad had no business whatsoever being in a canoe would be a gross understatement. My mom's natural habitat was sitting in her lazy boy recliner, watching soap operas and drinking a highball. And I feel it's important to tell you that her recliner was called the Queen's chair. We were definitely, more of a, name your recliner family than we were a canoeing family. My father was, a heavy-set guy in his mid-50s. He was a strong, sturdy fellow, but, his athletic days were long behind him at this point. So if you've watched any PBS nature documentaries, you can imagine the consequences of taking these two creatures out of their perfectly balanced suburban habitat and placing them in a canoe on a river. And for me personally, one consequence of that day is that even now, 45 years later, I still have a terrifying fear of drowning. When I think back to that day, what stands out for me is not actually the dramatic part of nearly drowning, but rather the almost incalculable series of improbable events that had to happen for us to be in that situation in the first place. Try as I might, I simply cannot imagine my parents wanting to go canoeing. This was not their idea. There's no way this idea originated with them. And so what that means is that somewhere out there was a definitely well-intentioned but deeply misguided friend or family member, or perhaps an article in Ladies' Home Journal suggesting this farcical outing. And while I'm up here assigning blame, I think I really need to call out the people at the canoe rental place as well, because they share some culpability in the events that happened. Did they ask any questions, or did they offer any words of advice when my father, wearing polyester slacks, dress shoes, and a cardigan sweater, approached them inquiring about renting a canoe for the day? But, improbable or not, eventually my family found ourselves in that canoe, and we set off from the banks of the Ohio River on our own adventure. Lewis and Clark set off from a spot actually not terribly far from where we were 150 years earlier on their expedition. It lasted 2 years. Ours would be over in less than 15 minutes. Now, the day sort of started off uneventful. Our boat kind of, lazily went down the river. We ran around a bend, but soon the water became more swift. And at one point, we found ourselves going with ever-increasing speed to a rock right in the middle of the river. And so, my parents, in an act of desperation that, in retrospect, is also a pretty good analogy for their marriage as a whole, responded to the threat by paddling furiously in opposite directions. And so this had the effect of turning the canoe sideways and capsizing us into the fast-moving water. Now, I don't actually remember any of this. I was 5 years old, and, most of the details I'm telling you come from my mom and the many times that she's told this story. My memory of that day is very simple. It was a sunny day. I was in a boat, and then I was underwater. It was cold. It was black. It was terrifying. For years afterwards, my mom would dutifully take me to swimming lessons. And she wanted for me to kind of get over this fear of the water that I had. And so she'd take me down to the community pool every summer, and the instructors would have us splash around and practice blowing bubbles underwater in the little, kids section of the pool. But I could never appreciate it, never have any fun because I knew what was coming. Despite my incessant prayers to an unlistening God, every single time the instructors would eventually get us out of the pool, line us up, and march us to the deep end where we had to swim. And so 5 days a week, every summer, I had my own little dead man walking moment where I would dutifully march along to my inevitable fate that was waiting at the deep end of the pool. Now, I was a pretty scrawny kid, but I say with some pride that it usually took about 2 adults to pry me loose from my vice-like grip on the side of the pool as I waded in the water for my time to swim. And, truth be told, I actually did more screaming than swimming on most occasions. And one time, I was so worked up, I actually pooped my pants in the pool. And when, the swim instructor saw it float to the surface, he took pity on me, and he let me skip my turn. I didn't have to swim that day. So, as you can imagine, that was a terrible tactical mistake on his part, because he set up some pretty perverse incentives for me. And so the pattern repeated for years. Lots of screaming, little bit of swimming, a modicum of pooping. Until one day when, I got to say, I was probably about 10 years old at this point. And so I'm, hanging onto the side of the pool, waiting for my turn. And, I turned to the kid in front of me, and I'm kind of looking for a confidant at this point. And I said, man, this is horrific. Why do they make us do this? It's terrible. And this kid turns to me and smiles and says, it's fun, in that, non-judging, earnest way that only a kid could. And no sooner are the words out of his mouth, but he pushes off from the side and starts swimming. And I watch him go, and all I can think is one thing. I think, God, I want to be like that kid. And then somehow, little 10-year-old me had this moment of enlightenment. And I realized I could be like that kid. Yes, I had a terrifying fear of swimming. It even has its own origin story. But I realized I could feel the fear and do it anyways. And so when my long-suffering swim instructor turned to me and told me it was my turn to go, I did the exact same thing that kid did. And I pushed off from the side of the pool, and I started swimming. And I didn't stop till I got to the other end of the pool. And I kept swimming after that for years. And then by the time I was a teenager, I actually completed lifeguard training. I got really good at it. And I wasn't just good at it, I actually enjoyed myself. I loved swimming. This thing that used to terrify me all of a sudden became something that I looked forward to doing. Now, I wish I could tell you that this was some cathartic, transformational moment of my life, and that ever since then, facing my fears was like a walk in the park. But it's just not true. I've had to face many fears in my life, and it's always difficult. And sometimes I don't rise to the occasion. But I found myself in a situation last year where I was arguably at the pinnacle of a 30-year career in the computer industry. I had all the, success and money and prestige and things that, anyone could have ever wanted, and all the things I thought I wanted. But I was miserable. Every morning when I woke up, I had this feeling of dread going to work, just like that same feeling of dread I had when I was a little kid having to walk to the deep end of the pool to swim. But I was terrified. Once again, I was consumed with fear, because how could I, give up this success in this career that I spent my entire adult life building to pursue something else that I wanted to do? It seemed intractable, and I felt trapped. And just totally random, out of the blue, I had this flash of being 10 years old again. And pushing off from that wall and swimming across the pool. And I decided to do it. So I quit my job and I moved to Los Angeles, and I decided to pursue my dream of being a writer. And, you know, once again, I pushed off. I haven't got to the other side yet, but I'm still swimming. Thank you.